On Thanksgiving morning, my son sat across from me at the kitchen table I'd built with my own hands 30 years ago, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Dad, you're 67 years old, and you've been drifting since Mom died. This house is too much for you. You need to let it go, and let us help you figure out what comes next." His wife nodded slowly from the chair beside him, the way people nod when they've rehearsed something and want to make sure the performance lands. That morning I had fresh apple pie cooling on the counter, a turkey in the oven, and cranberry sauce I'd made from scratch, using the recipe my late wife Margaret had written on an index card in her careful handwriting. By the time they drove away 4 hours later, I understood something I'd been refusing to understand for 2 years. My son didn't see a father when he looked at me. He saw an asset he hadn't collected yet. So I made a decision. I sold the house for $1.1 million in cash, bought a one-way ticket to Porto, Portugal, and set a scheduled email to arrive in my son's inbox exactly 30 days after I landed. What that email contained ended every plan he and his wife had ever made about my future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, because the beginning is the only way any of this makes sense. The house was in Asheville, North Carolina, a 4-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street lined with oak trees that turned gold every October. Margaret and I had bought it in 1991 for $112,000. We'd raised 2 kids there, my son Daniel and my daughter Claire. We'd hosted 30 years of Thanksgivings and Christmases and 4th of July cookouts. Margaret had planted a garden along the back fence that still bloomed every spring even though she'd been gone for 2.5 years. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 64. I was 65. We had plans, all the plans that people make when they think they have time. Portugal, actually. We'd talked about spending a month there once we both retired. She'd read an article about Lisbon, about the light in that city, the way it reflected off the river in the late afternoon. She never made it. After she died, I didn't know who I was without her. We'd been married for 41 years. I knew how to be a husband, a father, a provider, a partner in the particular and irreplaceable way that only one person in your life ever teaches you. I didn't know how to be alone. So I rattled around that house, kept her garden going, cooked too much food for one person, called Claire on Sundays, waited for Daniel to visit. He lived 40 minutes away in Weaverville with his wife Sandra and their daughter Lily, who was 10 years old and still thought her grandfather was the most interesting person in any room. The visits came less often as the months passed. Every 2 weeks became once a month, became whenever they could manage it. I told myself they were busy. Daniel ran a restaurant, or he had been running one. 2 locations, farm-to-table concept, opened during the pandemic and somehow survived it. That's what he'd told me. I hadn't asked too many questions. I should have asked more questions. Thanksgiving that year was mine to host. It always had been. I'd been making this meal since 1988. Margaret had trained me well. I was up at 5:30 to start the turkey. Had the pie done by 8. Had the table set with the good china, the wedding china, the set we'd received as a gift from Margaret's mother and used exactly twice a year every year of our marriage. Daniel arrived at 11 with Sandra and Lily. Lily ran ahead of her parents the way she always did, the way children run when they're still young enough to be genuinely excited about things. "Grandpa, is the pie apple this year?" "Always apple, sweetheart. Always apple." She climbed onto the stool at the kitchen counter and started telling me about her school play, her best friend's new dog, a book she was reading about a girl who travels through time. I listened and felt something close to normal. Daniel and Sandra came in behind her carrying a bottle of wine they wouldn't open and wearing expressions I recognized but told myself I was misreading. The expression of people who have decided something and are waiting for the right moment to say it. We ate the way you eat when there's a conversation, sitting underneath the table, waiting to climb up into the room. The food was good. It's always good when you've been making the same meal for 35 years. Lily ate 2 pieces of pie and asked if she could call her friend from my back porch. I said yes. She disappeared through the screen door, and the 3 of us sat there with the good china and the leftover turkey and the particular silence of things about to change. Daniel set down his fork. "Dad, Sandra and I have been talking, and we think it's time to have an honest conversation about your situation." My situation. He said the word the way doctors say it, like it's a neutral word. a clinical word, a word that doesn't contain a judgment. I'm fine, Daniel. You're not fine, Dad. Sandra's voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who'd practiced this. You're alone in this big house. You forget to return calls. Last month, you drove to the grocery store and came home with 3 bottles of olive oil and no food. That was one time. Margaret always made the grocery list. You're grieving, which is completely understandable, but grieving isn't a management strategy. I looked at my daughter-in-law and tried to remember when she'd started speaking to me like I was a project that needed managing. It had happened gradually, the way most erosions happen, slowly enough that you don't notice until you're standing in the damage. Daniel leaned forward with his elbows on the good china tablecloth. This house is worth what now, with the market the way it's been? I don't know. Over $1 million, probably. We've seen the Zillow estimates, Dad. 1.1, maybe 1.2 if you staged it right. That's a lot of money sitting in a house that one person is rattling around in. I like rattling around in it. You like being sad in it, Daniel said, and the directness of it surprised me. You sit in this house and you miss Mom and you keep everything exactly the way it was when she was alive because change feels like losing her all over again. I know you. I know that's what's happening. He wasn't entirely wrong. He was mostly right, actually. But being right about my grief didn't give him the right to what came next. Sandra put her hand flat on the table, not touching mine, just placing it there like a document. There are some beautiful continuing care communities here in Asheville. Independent living, not nursing homes. Your own apartment, activities, social programming, maintenance free. You wouldn't have to worry about the gutters or the furnace or the garden. I'll worry about whatever I want to worry about. It's my house and my garden. Daniel and Sandra exchanged a look. It was quick, but I caught it. The look of 2 people who've agreed in advance on what happens if the first approach doesn't work. Dad, Daniel said, his voice dropping into a register I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, asking for something he knew he shouldn't have. I have to be honest with you about something. The restaurants are in trouble, both of them. The second location never found its footing, and now with the way costs have gone up and traffic gone down, we're carrying debt that's starting to feel unsurvivable. How much debt? Sandra pressed her lips together. Daniel looked at his hands. Tell me, Daniel. $430,000, Dad. Between the business loans, the equipment lease, the line of credit. $430,000. 430. I said the numbers slowly, the way you say numbers when you're trying to make them real. He nodded once, tight and small. Sandra was studying the tablecloth. I looked at my son, 40 years old, sitting at the table where he'd eaten his first Thanksgiving, his first Christmas, his first birthday cake, where he'd done homework and argued about curfews and cried the day he got rejected from his first-choice college and laughed until he almost fell off his chair at some joke. Margaret made one Easter that none of us could even remember, the punchline to anymore, and I tried to find in his face the boy I knew. I found something else instead. The math is straightforward, Dad, he said, and the word straightforward landed like a tool. You sell this house. You net somewhere around $900,000 after fees and taxes. You move into a place that's designed for people at your stage of life. We use part of the proceeds to clear the business debt, and the rest sets you up very comfortably for however long you need it. For however long I need it. However long I live, Daniel. That's what you mean. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm not trying to be callous. I know you're not. But here's what I need you to understand, I said, keeping my voice even. This house is mine. It's the house your mother and I built our life in. You don't get to call it a liquid asset because you made bad business decisions. Dad. Don't dad me right now. What you're describing is asking me to sell the only home I have left to bail out a restaurant that your business plan didn't protect adequately. That's not fair, Sandra said sharply, and there it was, the sharpness she'd been holding back. He's done everything right. He's worked himself half to death building something from nothing. You want to talk about fair? What's not fair is a father sitting on over $1 million of equity while his son loses everything. I watched her carefully. She was angry, genuinely angry, but it was the anger of someone who had made up her mind long before this conversation and was frustrated that the conversation wasn't cooperating. I asked them to leave. Not loudly. I didn't raise my voice. I asked them politely, and I meant it. And they knew I meant it. and Daniel started to say something, and I asked again, and he stood, and Sandra stood, and they collected their coats. And Daniel said, "We're not done talking about this, Dad." And I said, "We are for today." And they went. Lily came back in through the screen door about 2 minutes later, confused about why her parents were in the car. I made up a story about Daddy having a headache. She looked at me with her mother's eyes and her father's skepticism, a combination that had always made me quietly proud. She hugged me around the middle and said the pie was really good, Grandpa, really the best one, and I held on to that for a long time after they drove away. I stood in my empty kitchen, and the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming and the last of the leaves coming off the oak tree out front, and somewhere down the street a dog barking at something it would never catch. Margaret's handwritten recipe for cranberry sauce was still on the counter where I'd set it that morning. I picked it up, put it in my shirt pocket. That was when I started thinking clearly for the first time in 2.5 years. I didn't sleep that night, didn't try. Made coffee at midnight and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote out everything I could think of. What I owned, what I owed, what I wanted, what I was afraid of, what Margaret would have said. She would have been quieter about it than me. She would have thought it through longer, seen more angles. But she also would have reached the same conclusion eventually, because Margaret had never once in 41 years allowed anyone to take something from her without choosing to give it. There's a difference, she used to say. Giving is a door you open. Taking is a wall they knock down. I didn't want my wall knocked down. I wanted to open my own door. The next morning I called my attorney, Richard Okafor, a man I'd used for estate planning for 15 years. I explained the situation in about 10 minutes. Richard was quiet for a moment, then said, "You've thought about this already, haven't you?" "I've thought about it for one night. That's enough for a man like you," he said. He wasn't wrong. I told him what I was thinking. When I finished, he said, "I can make that happen. It'll take about 6 weeks. Do you want to start?" I said yes. We started. I also called Claire that evening. My daughter lived in Denver, worked in hospital administration, had 2 teenagers who barely remembered to text me on my birthday. Our relationship was warm but distant in the way relationships get when geography and busy schedules do their work over years. I told her the full story, everything Daniel had said. The numbers, the requests, the dynamic I'd been watching build for 2 years and telling myself I was misreading. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have seen this. I should have been paying more attention. You have nothing to apologize for." "I do, actually. But what are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what your mother and I always talked about doing when we retired." Her breath changed. She understood before I finished the sentence. "Portugal? I'm going to Portugal." There was another pause, and then she said something that surprised me. "Good. Go, Dad." She said it the way you say something when you mean every word of it, and don't feel the need to add anything else. Good. Go. The next 6 weeks moved the way important things move when you're finally in motion, fast and purposeful, and almost dreamlike. Richard connected me with a real estate broker, a woman named Helen Park, who specialized in discreet off-market sales for clients who wanted to avoid spectacle. We listed the property through her private network. No sign in the yard. No public listing. Targeted outreach to buyers who'd been looking for established craftsman homes in Asheville's residential market. An offer came in 19 days. A retired couple from Atlanta, cash buyers, no contingencies, $1.1 million. I accepted before I had time to second-guess myself. While the sale processed, I researched. I had the time, and I had the internet, and I had the voice in my head that sounded like Margaret saying, "Well then, if you're going to do it right." I looked at Porto, because Margaret had mentioned it once. Years ago, something about a documentary she'd watched. The tiles on the buildings, the way the old city climbed up the hills above the river, the light. I found an apartment through a rental platform. Second floor of a 19th century building in the Bonfim neighborhood, exposed stone walls, tall windows, a small terrace with a wrought iron railing, and a view of rooftops and sky. The owner was a retired professor named Antonio, who responded to my inquiry in careful, formal English, and said the apartment had been in his family for 60 years, and he was very selective about tenants. We exchanged several emails. He said he liked that I wasn't in a hurry. I said I wasn't in a hurry for the right reasons. He said that was the best kind of not being in a hurry, and we had a deal. The scheduled email took me 3 days to write. I wanted it to be honest without being cruel, clear without being cold, final without being hateful. I set it to arrive in Daniel's inbox 30 days after I landed in Porto, using a delayed send service my nephew had shown me 2 years ago when I'd been trying to send Margaret's friends a birthday reminder. Richard reviewed the draft and said it was legally airtight and personally devastating and asked if I was sure. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything since the day I asked Margaret to marry me. He said that was either a great answer or a concerning one, and I said it was both. The house sale closed on a Tuesday in early January. $1.1 million became real money in a real account. I sat with that number for exactly one afternoon, then got back to work. After taxes and fees, I cleared just under $900,000. Added to my pension, my IRA, Margaret's life insurance, my savings, I had total assets approaching $1.6 million, enough to live the rest of my life anywhere I wanted to live it. I packed 2 bags, clothes for warm weather, good walking shoes, my laptop, the important documents, the photograph of Margaret from our trip to Maine in 2018, the last good trip we took together before the diagnosis, her in a yellow rain jacket on a gray beach, laughing at something off camera, completely herself. I packed her recipe card for cranberry sauce. I don't know why. I just couldn't leave it in an empty house. I drove to Charlotte, spent the night in an airport hotel, ate a room service burger, watched the news, didn't sleep much. My flight left at 7:40 in the morning. TAP, Air Portugal, non-stop to Lisbon, connecting to Porto. I was at the gate by 5:30 with a coffee, and the specific feeling of a person who has done something they cannot undo and feels grateful rather than terrified. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Daniel since the previous evening. The night before, he'd apparently driven past the house and seen the sold sign that Helen had placed at closing. He didn't know it was closed, had only seen the sign. He'd texted, "Dad, what is going on? Call me." Then 30 minutes later, "This is not okay." Then an hour after that, "Sandra says we need to talk as a family before anything happens." I powered the phone off, put it in my carry-on, and boarded. Window seat, left side, so I could see the lights of Charlotte falling away as the plane lifted into the dark. Lisbon first, for the connection. I had 3 hours. I sat in the terminal and ate a pastel de nata from a small counter and thought, well, this is happening. This is what happening feels like. The Porto flight was 50 minutes. I landed in pale winter light. The January sky, the color of old pewter, the air sharp and clean and different from any air I'd breathed in 67 years. Antonio met me at the apartment, a compact man in his 70s with white hair, and the particular dignity of someone who has lived long enough to have very little patience for things that don't matter. He handed me the keys and showed me the quirks of the place, which window stuck in the rain, which burner on the stove ran hot, which neighbors were friendly and which were private. The apartment was better than the photographs. The stone walls, the high ceilings, the light coming through the tall windows in long rectangles across the wooden floor. I stood on the terrace the first evening and listened to the city, the trams and the church bells and the sound of someone in a nearby building playing fado on a radio, that particular beautiful melancholy that sounded like it had been composed specifically for people who had left something behind and hadn't decided yet whether to call it loss or freedom. The first 2 weeks I barely spoke to anyone. I walked. Porto is a city built for walking if you have the knees for the hills, and my knees were fine. Better than they'd been in years because I wasn't sitting in a quiet house letting them stiffen. I learned the neighborhood, found the bakery that opened at 6, the cafe where the owner called everyone friend regardless of whether he knew you, the market 2 streets over where you could buy produce and fish and small ceramic things that had no practical purpose but were beautiful. I started a journal, nothing literary, just notes about what I'd seen, what I'd eaten, what I was thinking. Margaret had kept journals for 30 years. I'd never understood the point until now. The point is that writing things down makes them real in a way that just experiencing them doesn't. I was becoming real to myself again. I turned my phone back on after 2 weeks. Not because I was ready to engage with whatever was waiting there, but because Richard had said he needed to be able to reach me with any closing paperwork questions, and I trusted him to need what he said he needed. The messages were what I expected. Daniels had progressed from alarmed to angry to something that read like controlled desperation. Sandra had sent several that were factually incorrect about what I was legally permitted to do with my own property, which I chose not to engage with. There were calls from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be a lawyer Daniel had hired to, I gathered from the voicemail, explore my options, which was not a phrase that made me feel warm. There was one text from Claire that said, "I know you're somewhere beautiful. I'm proud of you. Call when you're ready." I called her that evening. She cried a little and I didn't, but I came close. She told me Daniel had called her 3 times, furious, looking for allies. She told him she didn't have anything useful to say to him about it, and she hoped he'd think carefully about what had happened, rather than just about what he wanted to happen. I told her she sounded like her mother. She said she knew, and it's the best compliment I can give you, Dad. The scheduled email arrived in Daniel's inbox on a Tuesday morning, 31 days after I landed. I knew because Richard sent me a confirmation that the service had delivered it. I also knew because Daniel called me 6 times within 2 hours. I didn't answer. I read the text that followed. It said, "I can't believe you." I read it, and I put the phone face down on the kitchen table, and I went for a walk. Here is what the email said, because he deserves no privacy about it from me in this telling. Daniel and Sandra, by the time you read this, I've been living in Porto for a month, and I've learned enough Portuguese to order coffee and thank people and apologize when I walk into things, which is more language acquisition than I'd managed in the previous 67 years. So I'm counting it as a win. I want to explain some things, not because I owe you an explanation, but because I believe in clarity. Over the course of your adult lives, here is what I have given you, Daniel. Down payment on your house in Weaverville, $60,000, 2014. Wedding costs for you and Sandra, $32,000, 2013. The loan you called startup capital for the first restaurant, $70,000, 2017, with no repayment to date. The additional infusion when you open the second location, $40,000, 2021, also unrepaid. Various emergencies, car repairs, a medical bill. The year the furnace in your house needed replacement, approximately $22,000 across 8 years. Total, $224,000. This does not include the groceries I brought to your house every other week for 3 years, the Lily's birthday parties I funded, the family vacations, the unconditional support, the showing up. At Thanksgiving, you sat at my table, ate the meal I had been awake since 5:30 to make, and told me my home was an asset you needed liquidated. You implied I was unable to manage my own life. You asked me to sell the place where your mother and I raised our family so you could pay down $400,000 in business debt that I had no part in creating. When I declined, your wife told me the math was straightforward. I'd like to offer a different calculation. I raised a son who saw grief as mismanagement and called his father's home a liquid asset. That is the ledger I'm sitting with. The house sold for $1.1 million. I kept the money, all of it. I am living in Portugal, where the food is extraordinary, and the light is the way your mother always said it would be. And nobody expects anything from me except Antonio, my landlord, who expects the rent on the first of the month, which I pay on time. I have set up a trust for Lily, $150,000, accessible when she turns 18, for education or whatever she decides her life needs. This is not a gift to you and Sandra. This is her grandfather choosing her future over his anger. The $430,000 in business debt is yours to resolve. I am not your emergency fund. I am not your retirement plan. I am your father, who loves you in the complicated and exhausted way of a man who has been failed by someone he raised better than this. I hope you figure out who you want to be, because the person who came to my house at Thanksgiving is someone I don't recognize. Tom. He didn't call again after the initial 6 calls. Sandra sent one email 2 weeks later, which said things that I'll summarize as, "You've destroyed our family, and Lily will grow up knowing her grandfather chose himself over her." I read it twice, felt the particular sting of an unfair accusation delivered with conviction, and did not respond. Richard confirmed that the trust for Lily was established and legally separate from anything Daniel or Sandra could access or contest. That was the thing that mattered. I was 4 months into Porto when I met a woman named Beatriz at a language school where I'd enrolled in an intermediate Portuguese class. She was 62, Portuguese, a retired architect who was taking the class as a joke, she said, because she'd spent 30 years speaking only technical Portuguese and had forgotten how to make small talk. She had short gray hair and the kind of directness that comes from decades of knowing what you're worth professionally and having decided it was time to apply that same standard to everything else. We started talking after class in the way people talk when they recognize something in each other. She knew I'd come to Porto alone. She didn't ask why at first. Then one evening over wine at a cafe near the school, she asked, and I told her. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I finished, she said, in Portuguese, which I understood by then almost completely, there is no shame in protecting yourself from people who have mistaken your love for weakness. I asked her to repeat it in English because I wanted to be sure I'd understood. She repeated it. I had understood. 5 months in, something arrived that I hadn't prepared for. An email from an address I didn't recognize. A Gmail account with a username that was clearly not its owner's real name, something like Pony Rider 77. The subject line said, "Grandpa, please read this before you delete it." I sat with it for 5 minutes before I opened it. It was Lily. "Grandpa, I made this email address because Dad checks my regular email sometimes. Mom doesn't know I'm writing this. She's been really upset lately and I heard her crying in the bathroom last week. They're going to sell the house, I think, the one in Weaverville. Dad's been really quiet, and Sandra says that means he's working you things, but I think it means he's sad. I know something happened between you and them. I'm not exactly sure what. I found the email you sent to Dad on the printer because he printed it out and forgot to take it from the tray. I read it. I'm 10, but I understood most of it. I'm not stupid. I don't think you did anything wrong. Dad should have paid you back. That's just being honest. I'm sorry they were mean to you at Thanksgiving. I was outside calling Emma when it happened. But when I came back in, I could tell something was wrong because you looked like how I feel when someone says something mean and you're trying to pretend it doesn't bother you. I miss you so much. I miss how your house smelled. I miss the apple pie. I miss that you always actually listened when I told you things instead of being on your phone. Are you okay? Is Portugal nice? Emma's cousin went to Portugal and said it was really pretty. Love, Lily. I read it 4 times. Then I went out on the terrace and stood there until the church bells rang for 6 o'clock, and the light turned amber over the rooftops, and I understood that I was crying, quietly and without much warning, the way you cry when something you thought was permanently lost turns out to have been surviving on its own somewhere, waiting. It was the first time I'd cried since Margaret's funeral. Grief comes in the forms you don't anticipate. I wrote back that night. Dear Lily, I am so glad you wrote. I want you to know that getting this email is one of the best things that's happened to me since I left, and a lot of good things have happened, so that's saying something. Yes, Portugal is beautiful. The city I live in is called Porto, and it's built on hills above a river, and it has the most extraordinary tiles on the outside of buildings, blue and white patterns that tell stories, and the food is wonderful, especially the pastries. You would love the pastries. I'm learning Portuguese, which is hard, but also secretly fun, like a puzzle that talks back. I'm okay. I want you to know that clearly and truthfully. I am okay. I'm more than okay on most days. About what happened with your dad, I'm not going to explain the whole thing to you because some of it is adult stuff that isn't fair to put on a 10-year-old, and some of it is still tender for me. What I will say is that I made a decision to take care of myself, and sometimes taking care of yourself means making choices that other people don't understand or don't like. That's not the same as not loving them. I love your dad. I love you so much, it's a little ridiculous. I always will. I need you to know something important. Whatever happens between me and your parents, my love for you is completely separate and completely permanent. It is not up for renegotiation. I've done something for you, a thing I'm not going to explain completely right now, But when you're 18 years old and you're deciding what your life is going to look like, you'll find out about it and you'll understand. It's from me and from Grandma, both of us, because she would have wanted this too. Can I ask you something? Would you want to video call sometime? You'd have to let me know if your parents know about it, because I want to handle this honestly. I don't want secrets between you and your mom and dad on my account. If they're okay with it, I'd love to see your face. If they're not ready for that yet, we can keep writing letters. Either way, I'm here. I love you, Grandpa Tom. She replied the next morning. She'd told her mother she'd found my email and written to me. Her mother had cried, she said, the kind of crying that's not exactly sad but not exactly happy either, the kind that happens when something complicated arrives. Her mother had said it was okay to call me on Saturdays if I was willing. Nothing about her father. I said Saturdays were perfect. The first video call, I had to collect myself before I answered. She was on her mom's laptop in what looked like a small apartment, not the Weaverville house, somewhere new. She looked older than the last time I'd seen her, which had been Thanksgiving, which was the worst context in which to have last seen someone you love. Her hair was longer. She was wearing a sweatshirt from her school's soccer team. She grinned at me through the screen and said, "Grandpa, your apartment looks like it's from a movie." I said, "Everything in Porto looks like it's from a movie. That's the thing about it." We talked for an hour. She told me about the new apartment, smaller but closer to her school. She was walking now instead of getting dropped off. She told me her dad was living somewhere else and they saw him on weekends. She told me her mom was working at a real estate office, was learning the job, seemed to like it on good days. She told me her grandmother's garden at the old house had been very carefully transplanted by the new owners, who had sent her mother a photograph to show her they'd kept it. When she said that I had to breathe through something, my daughter-in-law had thought to tell Lily about Margaret's garden. I held that for a moment and let it revise something in me, just slightly. "You look really happy," Lily said, tilting her head with the assessing look of a child who has learned to read adults carefully by necessity. "You look like a different grandpa. A better different or just different?" Happy different. Okay, good. I think so too. She asked if she could see the terrace. I carried the laptop out and showed her the rooftops and the bit of river visible in the distance, and the late afternoon sky going pink and gold. She said, "Grandma would have loved this." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I know she would have." We sat with that for a moment, the two of us on opposite sides of the Atlantic, sharing the particular silence of people who miss the same person and have learned not to look away from it. Months passed. 7, then 8. My Portuguese crossed from functional into something approaching fluent in casual settings. Beatriz laughed at my pronunciation and helped me correct it, which had become one of my favorite things about Tuesdays and Thursdays. I started writing for a small expat blog, just occasional pieces about starting over after 60, about grief and reinvention, about the strange grace of a new city that doesn't know anything about you, except who you're choosing to be in it. The response was more than I expected. People wrote to me from places I'd never been about things they recognized in what I'd written. That was new. That felt like something. 9 months in, Sandra emailed me. I almost deleted it. I almost did. I didn't. The subject line was, "I don't know if you'll read this. Tom, I'm not writing to ask for anything." I want to be clear about that from the first sentence because I know that's what you're expecting, and I understand why. I'm writing because I've been in therapy for 6 months, and my therapist keeps asking me if there's anything I need to say to people I've hurt, and the honest answer is yes, and one of those people is you. What we did at Thanksgiving was wrong. It wasn't a difficult conversation that got out of hand. It was a plan, a thing Daniel and I had discussed and strategized and decided to execute on a day when we knew you'd be vulnerable because the holidays are hard for you, and we thought that made it a good moment to press. That's not grief counseling or a difficult conversation. That's manipulation. I knew your son's business was in trouble before you did. I knew about the debt for months before Daniel told you. I encouraged him to approach you about it because I was scared, and I thought you were the solution to our problem, rather than a person who deserved respect and protection. I'm ashamed of that, not because it didn't work, but because it was wrong. You had given so much to us already, and we came to your table on Thanksgiving and asked for more with threats underneath the asking. You didn't deserve that. Daniel is working with a business counselor and a bankruptcy attorney, and it's hard, but it's real work and his real responsibility. Lily is doing well, She misses you. I think you know that. I miss you too, if I'm allowed to say that. You were always kind to me. I repaid that poorly. I'm sorry, Sandra. I didn't reply that day. I walked to Beatrice's bookshop, which she had opened 6 months ago in a narrow street near the cathedral, a small place that smelled like old paper, and was organized in a way that made immediate sense if you spent 5 minutes with it, and no sense at all if you just walked in cold. She was helping a customer when I arrived. I waited and looked at the books, a mix of Portuguese and English titles, a shelf near the window that she'd labeled with a small card in both languages, for when you need to remember who you are. I stood in front of that shelf for a while. When the customer left, Beatrice came and stood beside me and didn't ask anything. That was one of the things I'd learned to love about her. She knew the difference between when a person needed to talk and when they needed to be stood next to. After a while, I said, "My daughter-in-law apologized." She said, "That must have been hard to receive." I said, "It's strange when something you wanted stops feeling like what you thought you wanted." She nodded. "That usually means the wanting has changed into something more complicated." "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I think so." I wrote back to Sandra 3 weeks later. I needed the 3 weeks. Not to decide whether to respond, but to figure out what I actually had to say, what was honest, and what was just noise. Sandra, I read your email the day it arrived, and I've been thinking about it since. I believe you. That's the starting point. Not because I'm naive, but because what you described, the planning, the timing, recognizing the vulnerability of the holidays, that rings true in a way that a simpler apology wouldn't. Only someone who actually understood what happened could describe it that accurately. I'm not ready to have a relationship with you and Daniel yet. I want to be honest about that, rather than let you think we're closer to normal than we are. Trust isn't something I can speed up because someone apologizes well. It takes time and evidence and a willingness to sit with the uncertainty of not knowing how it ends. What I can tell you is that I no longer want nothing. 6 months ago, I think I wanted nothing from either of you. I wanted to be left alone with my new life and my grief and my slowly improving Portuguese and my complete freedom from expectation. I'm not in that place anymore. I'm in a place that might, in time, become something better than nothing. Lily is part of that. She is a remarkable person, and she has managed this situation with more grace and honesty than the adults around her, which should probably be something we all sit with. I talk to her on Saturdays. I plan to keep doing that regardless of anything else. The trust I've established for her is real and settled. That is her grandfather's unconditional thing, not contingent on how the rest of this resolves. Take care of yourself. Take care of her. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to be in touch more. Tom, she replied the next day. 2 sentences. Thank you for writing back. I'll wait. I put the phone down and went out on the terrace and watched the evening come in over the city. The lights coming on one by one in the apartments across the way, the river catching the last of the light, the bells beginning their slow count of the hour. I'm sitting here now, just over a year since I left North Carolina. The November air in Porto is cool and clear, and the oleanders in the terrace pots are still holding their last flowers. Beatrice is coming for dinner later. I'm making salmon, Margaret's recipe, the one with the maple glaze and the roasted fennel, the one I first made badly, and eventually made well, and now make the way you make things when you've stopped thinking about the recipe and started just cooking. I talked to Lily last Saturday. She's been cast in the school play, The Lead, which she told me with a kind of careful cool that I recognized as the performance of someone who is very excited and doesn't want to seem too excited. I was very excited on her behalf and made no effort to conceal it. She laughed and said, "Grandpa, you're embarrassing." I said, "That is literally in my job description, sweetheart." Daniel called 2 weeks ago, I answered. He didn't say much, and what he said came out in pieces, in the halting way of a person who has been rehearsing something and found that the rehearsed version doesn't quite fit the actual moment. He said he was sorry. He said he knew that wasn't enough. He said he didn't expect anything from me and he wasn't calling to ask for anything. He said he was calling because Lily had told him, apparently without being asked, that she thought it was time for him to try, and he had decided she was right. I told him I heard him. I told him it was a start. I told him I wasn't ready to have a full conversation about everything, but I was glad he called. We talked for 11 minutes about nothing consequential, about the weather in North Carolina, about a restaurant he'd been to, about the fact that Lily's soccer team had made the playoffs. It was the most ordinary 11 minutes I'd had with my son in years. When we hung up, I sat with it for a while, the fragile, ordinary thing of it, and thought about how much work would have to happen before ordinary became easy again, and decided that the work was probably worth doing. Here is what I know, after a year of living in a city I'd never seen, until I was 67 years old. Getting older is not a diminishment, unless you allow it to be. Your worth does not decrease because your utility changes shape. A man who has finished raising children and finished building a career and lost the person he loved most in the world is not therefore finished. He is a man with a completely cleared schedule and a lifetime of accumulated knowledge and more money than he needs, and absolutely no reason to live on anyone else's terms. The people in your life who tell you otherwise, who tell you you're depressing, who look at your home and see an asset, who calculate your approximate remaining usefulness, those people are not describing you. They're describing their own fear and their own need and their own failure to see you clearly. You don't have to stay in the room while they do it. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to sell the house, book the flight, show up in a city where nobody knows your name or your loss or your limitations, and build something new out of whatever you brought with you. It won't look like what you expected. It'll be harder in ways you didn't anticipate and better in ways you couldn't have imagined. You'll miss things. You'll grieve the life you left, even the parts of it that were hurting you. That's not weakness. That's the cost of caring about your own existence. Pay it. It's worth it. I am 68 years old. I speak Portuguese badly, but improving. I have a terrace where the light comes in sideways in the late afternoon and hits the old stone walls and does something I can only describe as exactly what Margaret said it would do. I have a granddaughter who thinks I'm funny, and a friendship with a woman who sees me clearly, and a city that has absorbed my grief without demanding I be done with it. I have a son I might someday find my way back to, and a daughter who has always known where I was and kept her light on anyway. I have $1.6 million, and a pension, and no obligations to anyone except myself and the people I have consciously chosen. My daughter-in-law asked to be forgiven. My son asked for a start. My granddaughter asked for nothing except the apple pie recipe, which I sent to her last month because Margaret would have wanted me to. The waiter at the cafe around the corner started calling me Americano.com, Cereso, the American, with a smile. I didn't know I was smiling that much. Apparently I am. That's the thing they don't tell you about choosing yourself. The smile is a side effect nobody warned you about. I'll take it.